Welcome to Park Media. I'm your host today, Vince Emanuele, and we are joined by Ruth Ben-Ghiat, who's the author of Strongmen, Mussolini to the Present. Ruth Ben-Ghiat is an internationally acclaimed historian, speaker, and political commentator for The Atlantic, CNN, The Washington Post, and various other publications. She is a professor of history and Italian studies at New York University and lives in New York City. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
Well, first, thanks for writing such a phenomenal book. Over the last couple of months, we have been really digging into different books and authors who are focusing on right-wing movements, including Kathleen Belew's Bring the War Home, Catherine Miller Idris's Hate in the Homeland, which examines the sort of like the cultural components of this in the U.S. And your book is, I think, one of the best books we've reviewed all year. Even though it's been a short year so far, we're only in March. It's really a phenomenal book, so thanks for writing it.
Thanks. It wasn't always the easiest book to write or the most pleasant book to write, but I was inspired by feeling that these stories had to be told.
Yep. So let's go straight into it. Your book examines the evolution of authoritarianism. And you define authoritarianism as, quote, a political system in which executive power is asserted at the expense of legislative and judicial branches of government, unquote. Your focus is on right-wing authoritarians, and I'll just name a few. You start with Mussolini, Hitler, Franco, Gaddafi, Pinochet, Mobutu, Berlusconi, Putin, all the way up to Trump. You argue that today's strongmen have deeper roots and that we must develop a historical perspective to properly understand them. And before we get into those different periods, which I'll ask you in the next question, can you talk a little bit about why personalist rulers are the most dangerous form of authoritarians, and also what distinguishes them from, say, other authoritarians?
Yeah, so first, I'm a historian of fascism, and so in deciding how to structure the book and who to put in it and who to leave out, I decided to focus on right-wing authoritarians. And Gaddafi is actually the exception. He was a man of the left, a revolutionary leftist, but he's in there because of his connections to Mussolini and to Berlusconi. And also it kind of shows that whether they come from the right or the left, if there's a dictatorship, they end up doing similar things. And one of these similarities I found was the concept of personalist rule. And this isn't a concept that people are very familiar with outside of like political science, but it refers to, it's kind of a subset of authoritarians who are, their personal ideological obsessions or financial needs or legal problems, and their quirks, their personality tendencies come to dominate the whole political life of their country. They come to influence domestic and foreign policy in an outsized manner. So you have, I start the book with Berlusconi in Italy, who didn't, like Trump, he didn't wreck democracy, but he damaged it. And he had this very suspect and intense relationship with Putin. And they were doing these kind of private deals. And Berlusconi took over personally all of Italy's policy toward Russia, totally boxing out the foreign ministry, all the diplomats. And he had a kind of Rudolph Giuliani figure called Valentino Valentini, who was his envoy, who went to Russia to see Putin and Putin's people. So this kind of personalization of policy, usually because they're doing illicit deals for financial gain, that's an example of personalism. And so I wanted to show one of the things about the book, although I talk a lot about enablers and followers, I wanted to show that when you have people of these personalities, and Trump had the same personality, like the outcome today is different. When you have these guys in there with very, they're kind of sociopathic, they're narcissistic, when you have them in there, governance is chaotic, governance is destructive, and there's a lot of casualties.
And well, we just saw that, and we're still enduring that from Trump's response to COVID, which you note in the introduction to the book. Let's go into the different periods, if you could, because for people who might not have a chance to read this, if you're listening or watching, please actually read the book. Don't just watch this interview. Actually get the book. But for those who won't be able to, your book focuses on 3 different periods, and the book is broken up into 3 different parts. Can you sort of define each of these periods? The first period is the fascist era, 1919 to 1945, the age of military coups, 1950 to 1990, and the new authoritarian age, 1990 to the present.
Yeah, so these are all phases of this broader authoritarianism. And the strongman figure, I'm kind of defining the strongman as somebody who uses all of these other tools, but he also uses machismo, and masculinity and virility is very important. So the fascist period, you have Hitler and Mussolini, and comes right out of World War I. And I give a lot of attention to Mussolini, who doesn't, he gets a short shrift compared to Hitler often, but he actually invented the authoritarian playbook. And these are tools of violence, corruption, propaganda, machismo, and the myth of national greatness. And Mussolini, was in power over a decade before Hitler, and Hitler actually adored Mussolini and worshipped him and wanted to replicate his march on Rome in Germany. It didn't work, and then Hitler went to prison. So I wanted to tell that story and really focus on the fact that Mussolini was kind of making it up as he went along, because there was no dictatorship. And then when fascism falls, you have this period of military coups. And so, because I'm looking at right-wingers, I have these through lines, like how neo-Nazis and neo-fascists in the 1950s, it wasn't good for them to stay in Germany and Italy anymore. So they went to Franco Spain. And then Franco dies in 1975, and they're going all over Latin America, because this is the golden age of, US-backed right-wing military coups. And some of them go to Pinochet's Chile. So there's this one guy who's a neo-fascist who I follow from, he's a youth in World War II, he's a fascist, and then he goes to Franco Spain, then he goes to Pinochet's Chile, and then he ends up back in Italy when Berlusconi comes in. So that's the kind of through line I wanted to show. So when the Cold War ends, there's no more rationale for these US-backed coups. So you have what I call the new authoritarian age, and Berlusconi is the pioneer. And so he was the first person to bring neo-fascists into the government, bring a far right party into the government. And so many things he did, including the relationship with Putin. It's kind of a premonition of what Trump would do later on. And so you have, Erdogan and Putin, and I go over, so that's how the book starts. So you see the 3 periods. And then the core of the book is these chapters that are thematic, each one goes over a century. So you have propaganda, so the reader can look at the propaganda chapter and see what stays the same and what changes. So personality cults are amazingly the same, the principles of them. But today you have social media, which kind of soups up and accelerates all the propagandizing.
And you mentioned in that chapter, I'm going to back up a second, but I just want to note in that chapter, you also note that with each changing sort of technological medium, you have these new leaders finding ways to use it. So straight out of the newspaper age and the age of propaganda newsletters to the age of television, now to the age of social media. And that you even note toward the end of the book, that I think it's toward the end, that Berlusconi sort of drifts into the age of TV, where I forget who you name as the person now who has utilized social media in a way that
Salvini. Yeah, so one of the things people ask, well, why do people follow these guys? Why do people fall for their BS? Why do people become enamored of them and their hatred? And one thing I discovered, because the book really, I wanted to show recurrences, what keeps happening over and over. And some of it's about human psychology, some of it's about social circumstances. For example, whenever there's been a lot of change in a society that some people find amazing and wonderful, and others hate it and find it destabilizing, such as when there's been a lot of progress in racial equity or gender equity or workers' rights. When there's been these changes, that's when these men come along and they become very appealing as a way of kind of turning things back. If you think about how Trump was trying to undo everything about Obama. And we were ripe for this. If you look at that framework, because not only you had 8 years of an African-American president who many people thought should never have been president to begin with, you had legalized same-sex marriage, you had full gender integration in the military, all these things that in particular, white male Christians felt they were losing authority, they were losing status. So that's one thing. But another thing is that a lot of these guys came to power with an experience in mass communications. Some of them were journalists like Mussolini and Mobutu in the Congo. Berlusconi was the master of TV. He owned TV networks. He really had a huge personality cult. He knew how to manipulate the attention of the media and the public in a very sophisticated manner. And you have Trump, who came from reality TV and is equally, as we get more distance, he's an extremely successful propagandist and marketer. And he kind of read the market for what was needed, according to the right, what needs weren't being answered. And so these men, because they come with a background in media and performance, let's say, they will be whatever the culture needs them to be to get to power. They are totally amoral, and they will ally with anyone, and they will be anything. So that's what makes them so dangerous. But it's also why people fall in love with them, right? Because they seem to answer what is needed in society.
Have you seen the documentary Videocracy?
It's funny you mentioned that. I have seen it, and I'm my class on propaganda, I'm teaching at NYU right now. They're going to see it next week.
It's such a good movie.
It's crazy. Yeah.
I'm going to interview the director here in the next couple of months.
Oh, that's great.
And I was I just went back and watched it again a couple nights ago preparing for this interview, and it reminds me. Look, we're in Michigan City, Indiana. I come from a long line of military veterans and union steelworkers. Trump, the whole rise of Trump, I remember a lot of my liberal progressive friends, Sergio and I both served in the Marine Corps. We were both in Iraq. We came home from the war and joined the anti-war movement and have been participating in sort of progressive political movements ever since. But we've seen some of our other friends, this is something else you note in the book, a lot of veterans are involved with these movements. I'm somewhat familiar with the Italian futurists, and of course, most of them veterans come back. These are people who have experienced extreme violence, and we've seen some of our friends go both one way, extreme right, and then also on the other end. And I think we probably hovered there, to be honest, when we were in our 20s in the extreme left land. But I think that's coming out of frustration. You're angry. You've seen all of this death and suffering. You want an answer for it. You're looking for enemies to blame. All of those things, I think, resonate with us. And then also, I don't want to go on too long because I want you to speak as much as you can. But just to give you some context of with Trump, where we're from, there's definitely a lot of what you're saying is true. I know some of my dad's friends who voted for this guy are it's gay people, it's immigrants, it's Muslims, it's this, it's that. But there was also a whole section of people that we grew up with who voted for this guy because of the aftermath of NAFTA, because of the aftermath of these neoliberal economic policies. And it made me think a lot as I was reading your book about the context in which these things arise. We've been thinking about and reading a lot about ISIS over the years because we were largely operating in Al-Anbar province in western Iraq and some of the towns and cities that were first taken over by ISIS. Thinking of the aftermath of World War I, the collapse of the great empires, the aftermath of World War II and the collapse of the colonial structure, and then the post-1990 world where you have this hyper-neoliberal economic program that runs through Russia, and then that's the context in which Putin comes about. And seeing it here at home with Trump has been very scary. That it seems to me from our perspective of where we live, like we need some big programs here to help people out, or else I could see this like coming about again. Too many of my liberal and progressive friends think we're over it. You know, they're like, okay, he's gone, it's over with. Now we've got Biden, maybe we can move on. I remember in 2008, people saying that the Democratic Party were going to run the show for the next 50 years and demographics were changing and it was all over with. I just wonder if you could touch on, sorry for rambling too long, but just if
No, it's really important.
If you could touch on like the context in which these men come about.
Yeah, well, you know, one thing you said, if you want to identify a strongman on the rise, you look for somebody who starts using grievance politics to appeal to people who feel disenfranchised, who feel left out, who feel like they're the losers of capitalism, and who also talk about victimhood, the nation's victimhood, and then they become also the victim. They become the symbol of the victimhood. And that's very tantalizing to people. Of course, the joke, the terrible, tragic, it's not a joke, but the tragedy is that these guys are always the biggest hypocrites ever. You know, all of Trump's anti-globalist stuff. Trump is the biggest globalist of anyone. His whole business model was about licensing his name abroad. And he's, you know, asking the Chinese to help him. He's asking, you know, he's getting help from the Russians. I mean, no one is less patriotic. They're transactional, men like Trump. But they're very good at using this negative politics of grievance. And so when Trump did his, when he accepted the inauguration, and then he repeated the message many other times, including, when he accepted the nomination, and he repeated it at the inauguration. And he depicted America as a kind of a rusted out wreck of a place. And at the inauguration, when he did this, I have this in the book, George Bush was there and he said, excuse my language, it's his language. He said, that's some weird shit. Because instead of an uplifting, inaugural speech, Trump was like threatening and he was depressing and he was saying we're just a piece of junk. And then, of course, I'm going to fix it. I'm going to save it. And when I heard that speech, it was one of the many times, I got very disturbed and felt dread, because this is what strongmen do. They push everybody down, they use crisis politics, and then they become the savior and they make people feel good while they're actually, you know, doing the opposite. So even Mussolini, who came from a background, he was the first one to do this BS. He came from a background of socialism, and very early on, like we're talking before he got into power as prime minister, he had some things that still were left over from socialism. And of course, the rhetoric of revolution, he was going to shake everything up, because these guys are always, they have movements, they're going to shake everything up. But when he actually started prime minister in 1922, and Italy was a democracy, one of the first things he did was massive privatizations. And nobody learns about that. He privatized the telephone industry, the insurance industry, like these are big industries, because he needed to keep the goodwill of his real backers, who were these big elites, big capital. So Trump did the same. You know, Trump going on about anti-globalism and the forgotten people. And then the winners have been big pharma, agribusiness, big anything. As long as you're big anything, or you were tied to Turkey or Russia and all those kind of illicit, you know, foreign transnational semi-criminal things, you did really well. So there's a lot. One of the reasons I wrote the book is to kind of show up these hypocrisies that repeat in history, and a lot of the myths that come up around this, like people used to say of Pinochet in Chile, who famously invited in neoliberal economics. Americans came in and people said, oh, he brought stability, it was law and order, and it was so good for business. Well, it was so bad for business that by the early 30s, I mean, it was very good for international capital and big industry, big media. but almost a dozen banks failed by the early 80s, and the state had to go in and make them public and take them over. So we don't hear about all of these other histories because authoritarians have been so skillful at propaganda. And so the book is trying to kind of, peel back the curtain on this because people fall for it again and again.
And some of the hypocrisy you note in the book is not just from the leaders themselves and the actions, the words they may use before getting into office or while they're in, and then the actual actions they're taking. But you also note, and you sort of alluded to this in your response, this connection to the enablers, big capital, the International Monetary Fund, banks, corporations. You note, I think, the Panama Papers somewhere in the book as well, that the enablers are often seen as some, and this is true too. We have poor working class white people in our region who I think do enable Trump in many different ways, but not to the same degree that his billion-dollar backers enable him. And this is something, this is a thread throughout the book, that what's often not discussed are the sort of more liberal institutions, also churches, houses of worship, not just churches, who have enabled these strongmen to come to power, and once they're in power.
Totally. Yeah. It's very much a history of enablers, because although these guys like to, present themselves as omnipotent Superman, they can do everything themselves. When somebody asks Trump, and who do you consult on foreign policy? And he says, oh, I have a big, beautiful brain. I just consult with myself, all of this. They are nothing without their enablers. So you have the political elites who take these extremists, and invite them into the system and mainstream them. And then religious institutions have always played a really important role to bring them constituencies, to legitimize them morally, and in particular to prop up this whole idea that they are the saviors of the nation. And so one of the ironies is that it's often been the most profane, criminal people, because many strongmen in my book came into power with criminal records. They're thugs, they're rapists, they're very, very bad people, and they become the ones who do the deals with major religious institutions. So first was Mussolini, who was a serial, rapist and sexual assaulter. He knifed people. He was a violent thug, and also extremely anti-clerical, no one more atheist than Mussolini. And he was the one who the Vatican made the Lateran Accords with, that created the Vatican's independent Vatican state that's still there today. Likewise, Trump. I mean, who is more amoral than Trump? And yet Trump is the one who's been embraced by not just evangelical Christians, but also Orthodox Jews, as a kind of someone with access to divine, he's there with a divine mandate. And he's actually delivered a huge amount for these groups. So it's not just that these religious institutions are hoodwinked. It's a mutual using, and it happens over and over again. And Berlusconi also had support of the Catholic Church, even though his right-hand man was convicted of mafia association. I mean, so it's over and over again. These alliances of pragmatic alliances with religious institutions.
I was just going to say it's a good segue, because I was going to ask about the context in which Berlusconi comes to power. And once again, another thread that runs throughout your book, at least that I picked up on, is that a lot of these gentlemen come to power in a context of a fragmented left. And not only a fragmented left domestically, but as you note in the context of Berlusconi coming to power, the fragmentation of the Soviet Union, the sort of tribalist conflicts, ethnic conflicts that opened up to the east, but then also in Western Europe at the same time, the traditional socialist parties, the workers' parties, the communist parties, they were all falling apart, or they were totally fragmented and had turned into 100 different parties.
Yeah, that's a great point. And Berlusconi is extremely important for setting. He set the whole template. He came in briefly in 1994, and here we are, just 5 years after the fall of communism, and he did this. He broke this taboo. He made a center-right coalition with his Forza Italia party, which was kind of a mainstream conservative for sure, and he allied with the far right party, which had been neo-fascists, and they changed their name, and the right-wing populist League Party. And so this was, it's called the center right, but it was very right-wing. And he had 3 governments. And the whole menu of what people do today, from demonizing and detaining migrants, he was one of the first to do that, Islamophobia, homophobia, all that comes with mainstreaming the right. And it's very important that, and I had a Fulbright in his when he came to power, and I noticed the shift in collective memory, where before people didn't want to talk about fascism. If I said I was there studying fascism, they were like embarrassed silence. And now so many people felt they could say out loud what they used to whisper or just say at home, that they like Mussolini. They thought he was great. He made the trains run on time. So I lived through this really decided shift. So Berlusconi was the first one to do all of that. And he was able to get away with it because you had the fall of communism, and Italy had the largest communist party, and the left was in disarray. But he also managed. This was pretty incredible, and due to his TV skills and his propagandist skills, communism actually fallen. It no longer existed, but he kept the threat of communism going. And part of this is they know that psychologically people like to fall back on traditional enemies. So for example, now when people, the whole Trump administration and continuing with the GOP, they talk about the radical left and communism's coming. It's like, there's no communism here, but people feel comforted at falling back on these polarizing truths. So it was just all the more notable that Berlusconi did it, because he did it just years after communism died, and yet he kept it going as a threat. And so when you look at his rhetoric, and then you look at what's Orban saying, and then Trump, he really was quite a pioneer in all things bad for democracy.
Well, my God, I remember when the right tried to portray Obama as a socialist during his time. And you could see some of this. I mean, it was interesting because the first question I had for you, or the way that you defined it, I wanted to ask you this, and this is a little outside of the book, but I thought of it as soon as I reread this to you. A political system in which executive power is asserted at the expense of legislative and judicial branches of government. It seems to me, you don't talk about this that much in the book, but I'm thinking of the Bush administration and the ways in which it subverted democracy and the legal system, not nearly to the extent that you document in the book from these strongmen, but how these, at the time, I think a lot of legal scholars and others were very concerned because it could set a precedent, that it wasn't as bad as it could get, but that by allowing these transgressions, you sort of open the door for someone worse to come along and use the same rhetoric, perhaps the same approaches, to then abuse power in an even more significant way. Do you think some kind of maybe a history of more moderate governments, still maybe right wing or left wing, but more moderate, who are use the system in ways that could open the door for people to then exploit it to a greater degree?
There's always that, and more remote times, you also have McCarthyism, which you had people blacklisted, you had people fired from their jobs. People would cross the street if somebody who was blacklisted came by them. They didn't want to be associated with them. So there's always that, but there also, and so it does show, it opens a window for people to realize that the system of democracy is more fragile than they thought. But a good example of Bush versus Trump is that, for the buildup to the Iraq invasion, there was institutionalized lying because they wanted to invade Iraq around that issue. But what Trump did is very, it's more advanced. It's the Putin method, the fire hose of falsehoods. He attacked the notion of truth on every subject. He lied about everything, and even that you could know truth, that there was a truth, was thrown into doubt. And so that's an advance on what Bush did. And so it's very interesting that, and Trump, I mean, my take on it is that, Trump, he never had any intention of governing as a Democratic with a small d president, whereas Bush was still in the frame of democracy. He stretched it, he abused it, and think about how he got in, the whole thing with Gore. But Trump really came from a different framework, and his goal was never, ever to govern in the sense of other presidents. No interest in public welfare. His goal was to make money. It's an autocratic, corrupt autocrat. His goal was to make money for Trump Organization. And that's why he spent 1 out of every 3 days at a Trump property. So 1/3 of his time was turning public office into a vehicle of private enrichment. And that's what they all do. And Putin has, he has a real kleptocracy where he's like a vampire. And all of the productive energies of Russia, the financial energies, they get sucked into and they get exfiltrated into his, offshore finance, wherever he's keeping his stuff. So there was but this was such a different frame of reference that even Bush, that's why Bush said, boy, that's weird shit. Yeah. Because at the inauguration, I was like, no, that's not weird shit. Well, it's weird for democracy, but for me, everything that he said and did was unfortunately very familiar. And I've given over 300 interviews since he came on the scene to try and educate also journalists about what they found before, what we were going through, because it's a fundamental shift of perspective to that many still haven't made the leap. Yeah. That he was not there to govern, and public welfare. Who cares about public welfare? And that's why, very tragically, is very, especially tragic that he was there when coronavirus came, because it could have been any disease, but he had no interest in governing at all, only interest in spreading anything that kept him in power and enriched him. So spreading hatred, building a personality cult, domesticating the GOP so they'd be loyal to him, and making money for his business. And honestly, he was extremely successful at those goals. Right. He was not successful at governing, but he didn't want to govern.
No, the differences are profound, and 100%. I guess the point I was making, though, Ruth, is that I think that's why it's that much more important for us to hold everyone accountable, even when they try and perform, say, an act of institutional lying. Because if we allow, to me, it's like you don't allow more and more of this, and you don't excuse what are lesser forms of this, because it to me then just opens the door for someone like Trump to take it to a whole different world.
Yeah, no, absolutely. So in that, and look and think about the abuses that we all see today of ICE and Department of Homeland Security, and all that creation, bureaucratic, repressive machinery creation that came after 9/11. That's part of it. And so definitely the Bush administration opened the door to the things that it made what Trump did possible.
The section you touched on a little bit of this, but I want to jump to corruption and violence because we only have so much time left, and I want to get to the end of the book. But the virility part, the part about masculinity, I found that part to be so important because especially the institutions in which Sergio and I have come from, we've seen how that's used. I mean, it's quite literally used as part of the indoctrination process through boot camp, through the School of Infantry, and then when you're in combat and even when you're back on base. And of course manifests itself in really disgusting and sick ways, like the fact that 1 out of 3 women who served in the military are reporting some form of military sexual trauma. But it seems to me that this is so much a part of this sort of right-wing culture as well. The Miller Idris book talks about these different places in which this is happening. So this is everywhere from like MMA gyms, so mixed martial arts gyms, places that I've been to in the past, all the way to like online chat rooms where this is taking place. And that all of it, like a central component to all of it. And Kathleen Belew points this out in her book, Bring the War Home, too. Is this like loss of purpose, yes, but also men coming home and feeling emasculated, men coming home from a war they lost, men in the Midwest losing their factory job and no longer able to provide for the family. But then the other side of it, which is like stoked by the culture, which is like, as a man, you know, you could do whatever you want with women. They're there for the taking. All of this is like all wrapped up in this. And of course you mentioned Mussolini, you mentioned his like serial rape behavior, Putin, Gaddafi's sex chambers and all of that, which is just totally depraved stuff. But I was wondering if you could sort of mention less about what they're doing and more about how you think about this within our culture. Like how are the ways in which this kind of like toxic bad masculinity is like being engendered within this culture, and how much, you know, should we, I think, pay attention to this?
Yeah, part of it is, you know, models of masculinity that are built on, which Trump personally embodied. He's amazing because he actually embodied every behavior from ogling to misogynistic comments to touching to raping, everything. He had his entire history. He touches all the parts of this. But it's glorifying this kind of model of masculinity, and seeing strength and domination. And Trump had a quote said, if you're not going to dominate, you're wasting your time. So that being in power means dominating. It doesn't mean collaborating. And obviously in institutions like the military, where you have chains of command, and it's profoundly about collaboration in the field, but it's also about hierarchy. There are certain institutions in society that could lend themselves more to this, especially when they're institutions where physical prowess and proving your masculinity through force, right? Like the military. But as we see also from what's going on with Governor Cuomo, I mean, these abuses of power and this toxic model of leadership based on arrogance also is not specific to any political party. And so one of the kind of stealth or not so stealth agendas of the book was to get us to look at these models of power that we embrace. I'm actually launching a newsletter with Substack called Lucid, and it's about abuses of power next week. And it's going to look at not only the toll of authoritarianism, but other forms of abuse of power, and think together about how we can promote models of leadership and authority and masculinity that are not founded on these concepts of domination and plundering. Because what authoritarians do is they set things up so they can plunder. They plunder natural resources, they plunder the economy and bodies and the whole thing.
I was just about to mention natural resources because people could be listening to this, and maybe in the U.S. context, maybe before COVID, although now there's still people who don't think it's been that severe having this guy in power for the last 4 years. But you mention in the book, and it's so important, that you use the example, I think, of I don't know if it was Barr or Tillerson or one of the others, but you used the example of the Arctic ice melting and the Trump administration.
Yeah, Mike Pompeo.
Pompeo, yes.
Major villain, major villain.
Yes, Major. I know. My brother actually works for the State Department, so yeah. Anyway,
Major
he's yeah, he is a major villain. But that in this context, in the context of ecological devastation, in the context of climate change, that the potential consequences of having these types of people in power at a time like this, when they see what could perhaps be the end of civilized species as we know it, that's not even hyperbolic to say anymore.
Yeah.
As an opportunity to make a buck, knowing they're going to die in 10 or 15 years. These guys are like all in their 60s and 70s too, which is just amazing.
That's yeah. Yeah. And that's why I think in one of the first paragraphs of the book, I said that the strongman style of rule is now an existential threat, because it's all about using and discarding. It's a very bleak philosophy of life, and it extends to the government, it extends to natural resources and climate and how you treat people. And creates a huge amount of destruction. And hopefully the pandemic has kind of made this more clear for people. Because we're in a very fateful period, which is also why I wanted to start this publication. So on the one hand, democracy is more and more challenged. The annual reports of Freedom House and other watchdogs, they show that fewer countries have stable democracies and authoritarianism is spreading. But we're also seeing record numbers of protesters around the world. Like nonviolent mass protest is at an all-time high. So there are these two big forces, and some people are protesting, it's climate activism or it's political repression. And some of it is mixed, right? But these two big forces are coming into conflict. And as you said before, a lot of these strongmen are aging. And they're not the type of people who appoint successors. Right. Because of their ego needs, they can't have a successor. Right. And so it's going to be a very interesting, period, very fateful period. But I also believe that the center and, let's say, liberals or people who are more centrist have not done enough to claim the space of patriotism also. For example, I am a pro-military liberal, social progressive, but pro-military. And it's been, in 2018, I wrote a CNN op-ed called, that said, liberals are reclaiming patriotism. And I thought that, I saw what was going on with Trump and the polarization of America. And it was up to us to reclaim a center and speak in ways that unite, like the military is an institution that crosses society, right? And so things like that. And I think that we need that kind of bridge building, and we need that kind of appeal to common themes like loving your country. And that is all the more important when you've had somebody in power who scorns the country and just wants to destroy it for profit.
It's a really interesting point. We just interviewed a historian, Harvey J. Kay, a couple months ago, and this is a trend I've been hearing more and more on the left. Like Harvey, I consider myself a socialist, a democratic socialist of that variety. And yet, what's interesting to me is following, both during the Trump era, following Trump's defeat, and then the post-January 6th timeframe, I have found some of the most useful analysis coming from liberals. Not from some of my friends on the left and not from some of my progressive friends who I think too often poo-poo existing liberal institutions. And if you don't have a viable alternative to replace them, and if the social political forces aren't available in the country to do so, it would seem to me that we should do our best to defend the very best of those liberal institutions from attack, because that's what we have and that's what we live under right now. That's an aside, maybe a digression. I don't mean to, I'm not going to like debate political ideology, but I found it interesting. I mean, I found that very interesting and frustrating that a lot of my friends on the left haven't taken up the mantle of patriotism, offering an alternative to the kind of like hyper-nationalism and xenophobia that's offered by the right.
Well, there are good reasons, and I don't know if you actually, what is liberalism right now? If you actually put my positions up, I probably would. I'm definitely a progressive on many things, but yeah, I think we're in this. The thing is, we're in this period where we're faced with a new challenge, and we have to kind of change the way we do things and the way we think about things to respond to it pragmatically, not giving, and that doesn't mean giving up our principled stances on dignified, like measures that will give people a dignified standard of living and racial justice and all those things, but it means being smart about messaging also. So, it was interesting that the Lincoln Project, when they did their Morning in America ad, that they actually influenced a lot of people, getting them together, and they're former Republicans who were responsible for some very bad trends in political life, that helped the Tea Party indirectly, that helped. And they were able to channel this grief for America and patriotism. However, how are we defining patriotism? I certainly don't define it in stupid nationalistic terms. But I feel I wrote this book partly because I felt very sad. I'm a first generation American. My parents are immigrants. I felt so sad at what was happening. And I've always been critical of when Bush came in and it looked like the Iraq War. I remember going on the subway with I had to stop because people were getting hostile to me, kind of anti-Bush, like stickers and stuff. So I guess I'm not as much of a sedate liberal in that way. But we really do need to be very smart about our messaging to win back people who toward the center, or we will end up with some form of like Viktor Orban's, government.
Ruth, not even people just from the center, but the working class poor people that we live around, including, we live in a city that's almost 1/3 black, and during the Black Lives Matter protests, a lot of our black friends from the city were like, what the fuck do you mean we're going to defund the police? They're like, nobody's defunding the police. They're like, that's not happening. Or abolishing the police. Now, like shifting funding in different areas, this all makes sense, of course. And in certain, again, like blanket sloganeering doesn't work. And I've talked about this on the program in the past, so I don't want to get into it too much. But blanket sloganeering doesn't work because you might have the funds to shift around, say, in a place like New York City, from, say, a hyper-militarized police force that's, has too much money to some social programs. But in a place like Michigan City, where we're already cash-strapped and there's no money in the coffers to begin with, there's no money to shift around. So already the more moderate demand of defund the police means nothing to people here. And it's literally, you can't do it in Michigan City because there's no money to move around. And the idea that we're going to abolish the police, even in a city like Gary, Indiana, which is still the largest blackest city in the country, 85% black, close to 80,000 people who live in the city, there were small-time protests, and most of the activists we knew in Gary were not demanding that we abolish the police or anything like that. And some of the counties, the last thing I'll say is there was a great report after the election in the Los Angeles Times about some of the counties in the Rio Grande Valley region of Texas, where Latino support for Trump had skyrocketed from 2016 to 2020. And some of the things they noted, or one of the issues they noted, was this call to abolish the police, that you had a lot of working class Latino families, first generation, just moved there. There are issues of like crime and robberies and so forth. So they're like, all of these things are playing a role. And so it's not just like people think of like the educated professional class centrist liberal who's opposed to this. No, it's like a lot of the poor working class people we know who just like are like, no, this doesn't make any sense to us.
Yeah, so that's a perfect example. And it's just, we don't have that much time because there, as we speak, there are so many laws that the Republicans are trying to pass to have voter suppression, and they want to get back in and finish what Trump and Barr and Pompeo and all these right-wing, people, what they started. They want to finish it. And that's a very scary thought. So we have to be very smart in how we approach things. And that means being thoughtful, probably means compromising on some things. But I'm not sure how prepared. It's also such a huge country. It's some of the places where you study that there's been more success countering autocracy. They're much smaller, and it's easier to get a kind of enough consensus to move forward. This is a whole different story.
Yeah. No, that makes a lot of sense. I've long thought that one of my biggest concern in the U.S. is a balkanization of politics in the U.S. It's not some sort of like one centralized system that's going to take over. All right. We've almost taken the entire hour of your time. If you want to read about more tools in the second part of the book, From Corruption to Violence, you have to get the book. If you want to read about the end of the book, resistance and the way that these authoritarian rulers, strongmen, go down, you have to get the book. The book is called Strongmen, Mussolini to the Present by Ruth Ben-Ghiat. It is an excellent book, one of the best I've read all year. Thank you for your time, Ruth. We really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Hey, thank you for watching and listening. If you think this program is worth a pack of cigarettes or a cheeseburger, you could become a Patreon for as little as $3 a month. The link is available at our website, parcmedia.org. That's PARC media.org. Make sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel below. Also, you could find us on Instagram at Parc Media, Facebook at Politics, Art, Roots, Culture, and you could find me on Twitter at Vince Emanuele.